I think the experience at Google or Microsoft really helps because it gives me sort of that grounding in what, especially at Microsoft, what successful partnerships look like. And Microsoft has, pulled off some unlikely partnerships, everything from its investments in Apple to its investments in OpenAI and partnerships with Yahoo. So along the years, it's done some fairly complex partnerships with entities that would normally be considered sort of direct competitors. And so there's certainly something for us to learn on how to be better partners with each other and go further as a result.
Welcome all, everyone to another episode of AI's Happy Hour. In an era where a handful of global corporations are defining the future of artificial intelligence, what does it mean for a nation of over a billion people to build its own? What does it take to create an AI that understands not just words, but culture, context, and the aspirations of a diverse society? Our guest today is someone who's mastered the playbook of market driven innovation, leading teams that built and scaled products to over $1 billion and billions of users across the globe. And now he's taken on a challenge of a different magnitude entirely, architecting BharatGen, India's national AI mission. He's the executive vice president at BharatGen and is recognized as a leading voice in India's AI ecosystem, championing the creation of homegrown models and infrastructure that empowers citizens, researchers, and developers to build AI for Bharat by Bharat. Rishi Bal, super excited to have you on AI's Happy Hour.
Sujit, I'm so glad to be here. It's been a long time coming, and I'm glad that we're finally able to sit down together.
Yeah, and all our pre-recording conversations have been absolutely fascinating. In fact, if I had my way, I would have probably loved to extend this into 2 hour conversation and see if we could break it into chunks, but we'll do a follow-up for sure. And Rishi, one of the things that I picked up right in our chat before the recording of this podcast was just your career journey, right? It's a fascinating story of two distinct chapters, if I have to look at it that way. The first is defined by this exceptional success in the commercial tech world, right? And still um, a lot of which involved research development and then getting to see those technologies out there in the wild world of users and what they do with that technology. And the second, your current role at BharatGen, right, is about building a foundational public good infrastructure. And you mentioned that you're still trying to run this initiative at BharatGen as much corporate as possible. Okay. This isn't just a pivot for you. It's like a fusion of two different worlds. What drove you to apply your commercial experience and expertise to a non-profit nation scale initiative? And in an initiative like this, how would you define success when the goal is not profit, but empowering an entire ecosystem?
I love that, Sujit, and I feel like this is a journey for all of us. It's been very clear that AI is going to be incredibly transformational to the whole world and every aspect and touch every aspect
So,
of our lives. And so, when we thought about how we're going to, build this AI, one of the things that was very clear to me was it wasn't just about building a model. It wasn't just about building an application. It was really about how do you lift all boats? Like, how do you actually create a thriving AI ecosystem in the country where like all of us can succeed together, right? And so even as we got started on this journey, it was very clear that the for-profit, 10x VC money returns or more, as they would like, wasn't going to be the right model for us here. Because if we wanted to invest in the nation, then we needed to have investors who were going to go along with us on this journey and who understood what our objectives here were going to be. And so as you start to think about, okay, if you want to do this in India, what's the best way to do it? Well, one thing that popped into our heads was let's do this as a non-profit so that we can maximize the engagement by everyone possible, right? And so just that non-profit tag means that we automatically become a good partner because we're not the competition. for most people. And then the other thing was we asked the question around, okay, if we're going to build this in India, what's the right model? Where's the talent is one of the first things that you start off, right? When you think about building AI at this scale, you think about finance and the money needed for it, and when you think of the talent base for it, right?
Yes.
And so in that
Yeah.
talent base, I think the thing that struck us was in India, a bunch of that talent is both resides both in the top institutes in the country, and then also resides
Hmm.
inside some of the research labs that have sprouted up across the country as well. And so we said, hold on,
Right.
let's find a way to to get together the educational institutes, the top IITs, right? And so we said, okay, we want IIT Bombay and Madras and Kanpur and Kharagpur and Delhi, and Hyderabad. And I don't want to miss any IITs, but we said let's get all the top institutes together, and then let's combine all of these top institutes, IITs, triple ITs, IIMs, with like an industry setup, like the best of engineering that we can bring. Like we know how to do high scale engineering, we know how to do research through the academic circles, and then let's bring the government in as a source of funding and distribution. Um, and we made this unlikely thing actually come together. And so we're pretty excited about the ingredients that we brought together for BharatGen.
Okay. One is even getting so many of the stakeholders, like institutions, government, etc., together. That itself is like a behemoth of a task, right? As in, I'm sure that's itself been a learning curve while you folks started off on that journey. I also remember you having called out, right? Um, because you're a not-for-profit and your intent is to solve for the nation, you don't have a competitor. And for you, success is not when it is actually defined when a startup uses what you built without paying a dime. And if you can get an entire ecosystem to start thriving on what BharatGen is enabling, this completely reframes the narrative and the mindset, right? And how does this collaborative nation building mindset change, especially for someone with your background, your day-to-day decisions when it comes to prioritization compared to, say, your time back in a profit organization where it's all driven by the end outcome is we need to drive more users, which will drive more revenue, and so on and so forth. Is there a framework that you've kind of arrived at on how do you prioritize? Because the scale is huge, and I'm sure there's a ton to be done, but how do you decide what to do first? Because it's going to have the biggest impact on what your end goal and objective is.
So Sujit, the sort of great unlock for us with this model is partnerships. So that ability to be a great partner, whether it's a startup, whether it's a state government, whether it's the central government, whether it's a semi governmental or regulatory body, or whether it's a large established company. That ability to say, we want to come in as a partner. We're going to solve some of the hard problems. We're going to do this together. And we're happy to bring in other partners to go solve complementary pieces of this problem, right? So I think a lot of it just starts with saying, how do we be a great partner to all the people that we're working with, right? And that flows from people who are downstream in terms of using the work that we're doing, but also upstream in terms of people that want to volunteer and contribute data or participate in whatever other ways. So I think starting the conversation and framing it up as a partnership, I think is a big first step, right? And then how do you go look for a win there? And
Very
as a
true.
partner, I'm always asking the question, who else can I bring to the table? Who else can join me to solve this problem in an interesting way, such that we can again move forward in the best way possible. So maybe it kind of makes it a little bit easier because I don't feel like we need to compete or hold back all the
True.
time. It's sort of like, hey, who else can I invite to this party?
Awesome. I love that perspective. The only caveat, and this is probably from my experience over the years, right? As in, India has got a very loosely held social partnership ecosystem. Okay. It exists at scale, but it's not probably the most efficient, not the kinds that you see back in mature markets like US, where partnership ecosystems do take a lot of effort here for it to work, operate, and be able to bring the good of what those partnerships can actually unlock to the forefront? As in, is this something that you're experiencing? As in, and does your experience from organizations like Google, Microsoft really help you in solving some of those pieces to bring in a lot more efficiency so that you can find that win together faster or sooner than later?
Great question, right? So you put your finger on something, which is that we are inherently a relatively lower trust society
True.
than what you might get operating in the United States, right? And that sort of
Right.
manifests itself in strange ways, like the number of OTPs we enter, right? From every, if you're traveling abroad, you're not entering OTPs every time you
You're not.
enter or exit and Uber. But in India, there's always that OTP element because there's sort of like this natural, a higher level of natural doubt, right, between the parties that are involved. So I think it's an interesting starting place to say, okay, there's an element of doubt. But what I love about it is that there's a lot of the doubt is fairly upfront, and we're
Mm.
a fairly vocal group, right? And so people are not
We
afraid
are.
of asking, so what's in it for you, right?
True.
And I love having that conversation upfront, right?
Nice.
To talk about what we're doing and how we think about success and what might be a successful outcome in these partnerships. And you just sort of like front load these conversations and say, okay, here's some models that we might use. I think the experience at Google or Microsoft really helps because it gives me sort of that grounding in what, especially at Microsoft, what successful partnerships look like. And Microsoft
Look
has,
like.
pulled off some unlikely partnerships, everything from its investments
True.
in Apple to its investments in OpenAI and partnerships with Yahoo. So along the years, it's done some fairly complex partnerships with entities that would normally be considered sort of direct competitors. And so there's certainly something for us to learn on how to be better partners with each other and go further as a result.
I love that. I love that you can bring a lot of that experience to play here. I'm going to dive into your product management leadership, right? As in, you've gone now from someone who's like T-shaped, right? Where you deep dive into the product management and leadership domain to now what sounds like nation scale builder. Okay. Here you're to manage policy, academic collaboration, and national stakeholders who probably have very conflicting or different kinds of end goals and objectives. What new muscles did you have to build for this role that your past experience simply hadn't prepared you for?
That's a really interesting question. I think there's so I hadn't worked very closely with a government setting, never mind an Indian government setting.
Hmm.
And hadn't, outside of grad school, hadn't worked very closely with an educational setting. And there's definitely lots of new things to learn as you enter the space. And so I feel like I missed a few chapters, maybe books in my civics classes on how government works. That, I feel like I've had a fast track to learning. How does the elected and non-elected portions of the government work? What are the incentives? But as a friend and mentor told me, Rishi, at the end of the day, people are the same. And so if you go back to your corporate experience on understanding what made your partnerships there work, which is you have to go back to the fundamentals of saying what makes this individual or organization successful and how am I enabling that organization or individual success, right? That doesn't change. That's a consistent theme. Now, the metrics of how that individual is being evaluated, both the explicit and the implicit ones, do change. Some of it
So,
is not readily visible as to what those metrics may be. So it takes a couple of months to go figure out what are the invisible metrics that people are optimizing for within each environment. And that's not new, right? Even if you were to go to a large company, corporate setting or medium-sized company, it takes a couple of months to go figure out what the visible and invisible metrics are. And once you figure out what those metrics are that people are optimizing around, you can then use that to create a framework for again that partnership and going forward. But there's definitely that maybe in on a lighter note, I have learned the importance of sitting order whenever you get into a meeting. There's definitely a protocol around who sits where and when, which you have to learn to respect.
Oh, yeah. Some of these protocols actually help you be a lot more efficient in how you collaborate and also enable decision making, is what I've learned more as an observer, not as a participant.
I know I'm not supposed to ask you questions, but I'm curious. Do tell me more.
I will offline
All
though.
right, sounds good.
Awesome. Okay, let's deconstruct and double click on sovereign AI, right? AI for Bharat by Bharat is what BharatGen is endeavoring to solve and achieve. When people hear LLM, okay, or a large language model, their first thought goes to find parallels with platforms like ChatGPT or Gemini. But BharatGen seems to be fundamentally a different proposition, right? It's more described as soft digital AI infrastructure that is quintessentially Indian, solving for Bharat. Can you help articulate the core mission of BharatGen as and maybe it's also evolving as you figure out what all is possible and why having a sovereign indigenously developed AI is not just a matter of technological competition, which a lot of us feel like, hey, we are left behind in the race and we have to compete, but more a matter of national priority.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I think this is one of those pieces which is such a critical piece of infrastructure. So I think if you play the world out 20 years out into a world that is thoroughly imbued with intelligence that is augmenting all activities in our lives, you realize sort of what a great dependency we're going to have on that piece of technology, right? And so you could parallel that to critical infrastructure that we rely on today, right? We rely on electricity today. We rely on the fact that you can flip a switch and your lights turn on, your fans turn on. When you back your way then from that future in which AI is imbued into everything that we do, and work your way backwards to say, in order to be successful in that world, what do we need? Right? And I think it'll come back to at least three pillars that we think a lot about at BharatGen, right? And sovereignty is one of them. I'll talk about three of them: sovereignty, Indianness, and accessibility. Now, sovereignty is, to begin with, it's just a guarantee that this AI and this technology will always be accessible to you, right? So that it's not a matter of, somebody says, hey, I don't like what you're doing as a country, as a state, and so we can just turn off the spigot, right? Whether that's an API or open source LLMs. Another aspect of sovereignty is absolute control over what you're putting inside your infrastructure, right? Do you actually understand what's in your AI and how it's going to behave under all sort of critical situations, right? You need to remove that element of unpredictability as part of sovereignty because you know exactly how that AI is going to perform. And then the third thing as part of sovereignty and that control is the knowledge that if you ever have an issue, if you ever have trouble, that you have somebody that you can call and say, look, I have this issue with this AI, and somebody is going to wake up and take that call at 2 a.m. and say, okay, we're going to fix this for you, right? And that's a critical part of sovereignty, and that's one vertical. The other thing to think a lot about is Indianness, and we think a lot about Indianness in the context of language, culture, and perspective, right? And language is fairly self-evident, right? We've got a lot of languages, dialects, scripts, and we need to ensure that we can support those. But the more nuanced and interesting one is culture and perspective. And there's a couple of examples that I like to share on culture, right? And so with culture, for example, somebody on my team pointed this out to me and said, when you go to some of these models and ask just normal everyday questions like, "Hey, there's a stranger at my door. What should I do?" The answer you're liable to get is like, quickly lock the door and call 911, right? And this person on my team is from a town in Uttar Pradesh, and he says to me, he says, Sir, हमारे यहाँ पे तो पहले पानी पूछते हैं, right? Right? And I absolutely love it, right? It's like, right?
Absolutely.
And that's culture, right? You could go
Correct.
across the span of the country, and the first thing that you're going to be asked when you walk into somebody's house, or be offered, is a glass of water, right? Right? And then there's perspective, right? Which is, if you ask the question around, what is Kashmir, or who does Kashmir belong to? I think some of the Western models will offer you this sort of multi-dimensional perspective on, here's what India says, and here's what China says, and you can go round and round. But if I apply an Indian perspective or lens on it, it's like Kashmir is India. And then you can talk about all the other perspectives out from there. It's not to say that we should be at the exclusion of perspectives, but I think that the primacy of a local perspective is something that's very important, right? Which is why every country writes their own textbooks, right? We don't rely on British textbooks to tell our history. And so it's going to be important for all countries to think about language, culture, and perspective. So that's the Indianness portion of it, right? And then the third part is around accessibility, which is the greatest potential of AI is for those who have the least access to it today, right? And those are the people who stand to benefit the most from it, right? So it's the person in a village that does not have access to a great secondary school, or a tutor, but is aspiring to apply for a competitive exam, right? How does AI bring that education and enablement to that person? Now, when you sort of take a step back on that, there's a few things that emerge. One is to make sure that you know cost is something that we have to think deeply about in terms of accessibility. Right? In India, we need to operate at a tenth of a cost that you may operate in the West. Right? And so cost is not an afterthought. Cost is something that you have to think from day one about how you're going to build the technology you're going to build, right? Or we have poor functional literacy in the country. And so voice becomes really important. We are a we are a talkative nation, right? We talk to each other a lot, right? And that's how we consume media too. So it's really important to ensure that we have voice first investments that work. Or you think about areas that may not be commercially interesting, maybe agriculture, maybe or maybe something that's culturally relevant, but maybe something that another country may not invest in, like Ayurveda, right? Right? So it's up to us to be able to make AI accessible. So those are three pillars that we think a lot about: sovereignty, Indianness, and then accessibility.
And I love that the three pillars, by the way. And thank you for double clicking and diving deep into giving different angles to what each could mean, right? Like for example, if before I heard you, if you asked me Indianness, I would go to probably culture and language. Okay. And a lot of that nuance gets missed because there's so much more to it that you need to solve when you're talking about Indianness. I love that. I'm going to double click into the same core mission, right? But actually throw up a question that keeps popping up. Now, BharatGen is generally used as an analogy. The reference is made to the kind of payment networks with UPI or UADI, etc., which is the sort of public digital infrastructure that's being built out. I mean, in this case, it's already built, and you're building this one out. Is the core concern that without a sovereign AI, India's digital information ecosystem, which includes its laws, its social customs, its public services, would be vulnerable to foreign models that fundamentally misunderstand the Indian context, or we are probably misreading this completely, or probably over pivoting in a direction of that it will be vulnerable.
I I think in addition to the three things that I talked about earlier, the other thing is a concern around being left behind. And what I mean by that is, if you want to be competitive in any industry, it's really important to participate in that industry from day one. Because once that building has gone up to 100 floors, it's really hard for people to catch up. And a great example, again, I'll keep going back to analogies, is aircraft engines. right? Aircraft engines are incredibly hard to build because there's so much science that goes behind it and so much engineering goes behind it, and it's actually across domains. So not only do you have to have advanced material science, you have to have advanced machining, you have to have advanced assembly, incredibly small tolerances. So you have to have an advanced trained labor force. Um, and if that's not enough, you need to have advanced control systems. And it goes on and on. And then if you sort of double click into each one of these, like the supply chain for each of these gets even more complicated, right? Now, if you don't participate in AI from the get-go, then the risk is that that entire supply chain doesn't really get built up, and then you become technologically beholden to other sources of this technology, like we have in the semiconductor space, right? Where, we've not really kind of, gone into that supply chain. We are now trying to do it, but it's going to be a decade plus of work to try and get there. So I think in addition to the three pillars that I talked about, I think, being in the race from the get-go, competing, building that ecosystem, I think is super important.
I'll go to another core problem statement, right? As in building models, building the infrastructure to be able to support is one part of the problem to be solved. The other part is the data problem. Okay. Well, one of the reasons a lot of the global models have a challenge in terms of being inclusive when it comes to diverse nations or economies like India is the lack of data. And India's vast linguistic diversity and cultural heritage, as in, does mean that a lot of that still is not codified, and data is a big problem still to solve, to be able to solve for that. As in, how are you, as part of the whole BharatGen initiative, also trying to enable that ecosystem? Because that has to be a continuous feed into what we are trying to build here.
Yeah. Yeah, no, for sure. That's a really tough one. And in part, like the LLM wave has been powered by this unique intersection of two things that happened over the last few decades, which is this explosion of content available in English that's online. And then also, the explosion of compute by unlocking GPUs as like a specialized form of hardware, right? Now let's try and map that to India. And, while you still have access to the compute, if you can put the money together, the data portion of it, I think, remains a challenge because you can't simply buy your way into data. And this actually needs a lot of on-ground investment to be able to unlock data. So we have data. We've got people we have a tradition of writing poetry and contemporary accounts, but a lot of it is locked in places that are not accessible, right? And so it really begins with saying, how do we go back into the supply chain, as it were, of data and actually start contributing in that portion. I'll give you an example of one of the things that we're doing at BharatGen is there are already efforts underway where people are digitizing libraries of out of print books, right? Now, these books could be 100 years old, they're getting scanned, but they have all sorts of issues. With these old books, the paper is yellow, the corners of the pages are damaged, they're stained, um, and simply scanning them is not enough. So those need to now be actually converted into text, which could then be used, which we made searchable. It could be used for training models. And so we saw this as a space that really needed help. And so we actually created, we went in and first of all, like, you know, hacked together a solution that says, how do you actually deal with this class of problems and tables and two columns and multi-column formats? And there's like, you could just go down the entire tree of what goes wrong when you try to read data from different types of books, right?
Absolutely. Yes.
And so we said, okay, we've got a reasonable solution around this, but we said, now let's make this broadly available. So we've actually gone out and offered a number of organizations. It's an open offer that says if you're trying to preserve heritage by scanning text, we'll do the work of converting that into digital text for you, and we'll do this for free. And we'll request, but you're not obligated. We'll request that you give us a copy of that. Let us keep one copy of that data to train our models. We're not going to replicate the books or anything else, but we just want to train the models. And
Uh-huh.
it's been incredible. It's been incredible to see the interest, and most people come back and say, yeah, go ahead, keep a copy, you know, train an Indian model, make it better. And again, by the way, that connection back to the nonprofit really comes in because people can
It
see
does.
what we're trying to
And that's super cool. It's almost like you're building the factory before the car, and you need to solve the data problem too. And I love the way you're approaching it, but obviously uh, it's a huge task to solve for it. And I wanted to double click, and we briefly touched upon this in the beginning, right? And I'm going to kind of make the correlation between your product management leadership experience and what you're trying to do here at BharatGen. While the vision is monumental, there are these complex pieces where you have to solve for data supply chain itself, while you try and build the model environment and ecosystem. And that's where execution is where the complexity truly lies as you're trying to bring together everything at BharatGen, right? And it isn't like a single product built by one company. It's like a whole consortium of stakeholders. Now, as someone leading this initiative, you are not just managing an internal team, you're orchestrating like an entire national ecosystem. How do you, in a scenario like this, forge a coherent product roadmap where everyone involved in this distributed consortium is kind of aligned on where we are headed? How are you solving for it? As in, I genuinely want to figure this out.
That's awesome. I'm not going to make a claim to either be leading a nationwide effort, nor am I going to make a claim around actually bringing people together around exactly one vision. What I will say is, as a company, we're very focused on one vision of what we're trying to do, and then figuring out ways in which wherever people have differences of opinion or divergences, the question I ask myself is how do I enable them to go down that path as well, right? So, as an example, let's say we do have a legal LM, but let's say somebody says, you know what, I think this, you know, um, animal husbandry should be an area that we should focus on,
Mhm.
and maybe that's not on our core priority or roadmap. And but the thing I'm always up to is to say, great, how do we figure out a way by which you can go collect the data, and we can help you create a pipeline for maybe an SLM that focuses on animal husbandry, right? Which is how do I unlock and unblock you, my partner, to go build this thing that may not be on my roadmap. But what I will say, Sujit, is that it's been surprising, but I think generally I would say we've been able to, like, everybody's got a similar set of goals, and it's not been as hard as it would seem to say, let's go after this roadmap and here's what it should look like. Every now and then we'll argue about which language should be next, and we all have our
Mhm.
biases on it. And whenever that happens, I try to say, look, let's just create a sorted, descending list of like number of speakers per language, and let's just use that as the tiebreaker where
That's
possible.
nice.
Yeah.
Okay, and since you touched upon this, the bias word, right? Uh, because data is involved in this. Obviously, it has to be a data first approach as we keep on enhancing this initiative and enabling the larger ecosystem across the country. How are you embedding principles like solving for bias, also solving for fundamentals like privacy, which all revolves around responsible AI, right? And mitigating this right at the get-go rather than looking at this as an afterthought later. As in, how are you solving for some of these pieces right at the beginning?
Wow.
And I know there's a
Wow.
ton to be done, and this also has to be solved. As in, you can't look at solving this later. And especially undoing or redoing something like this in an initiative like this is going to be a nightmare, is what I would believe.
So, Sujit, there are no easy questions with you, are there?
But I think with all that you and the team at BharatGen are doing, I'm sure you folks are really asking all these tough questions and working towards them. And I know you don't get answers on this on day one. You can't align everyone on day one. But if they're fundamentally being thought about, I would love to hear how is it really being put into action in whatever form, as in, because I think that will also educate so many of the builders who would listen into this episode, Rishi. If it can be done and as in thought, done, executed for a complex initiative like at BharatGen, I'm sure we can do that with anything else that we're building.
It is so hard, and it is one of those things that's just not solved on day one. Um, and I think there's lots of fundamental different schools of thought, right? How much of this
Hmm.
is, you know, epistemology, how much of it is ontology, what's the right framework on how to break this down, right? So there's sort of like, there's a simplistic sort of guardrails driven approach, right? Which is, post post processing, can you actually see if you can filter out what an LLM is expressing? But I think the fundamentally more interesting thought is how how do you how do you have it trained in a way that um, sort of factors in its own understanding of the world and behavior as it generates responses. And that I think is going to be one of our open areas of research is can you bring different schools of thought, right? To, can or should an LLM have a Socratic dialogue with itself, before it even answers a question? You know how with
That'd be cool.
right? With humans, what they say is wait for 3 seconds before you say something. Give that give a thought 3 seconds. And I think the question is, what would that 3 seconds of thought for an LLM be? Just in terms of not just filtering, but also like just, in this context, what's the right sort of framing for a response? But I think philosophically people might argue that the problem goes even deeper because it goes back to the nature of like what is the nature of knowledge? What is the extent to which an intelligent form is aware of its own gaps in intelligence? So it starts to get pretty deep pretty quickly, right? So uh, I I don't know. Like I feel like this is not going to be something that we are going to solve, but I think we have to learn more about this. And I really think we need to go deeper. It's way beyond just, don't use these words and slapping on some guardrails that prevents, certain things, types of things from being said to actually thinking.
And I hear you. As in, it is complex. And this is just a follow-up question, Rishi. Considering how critical it is for us to solve this, especially as the end objective of the initiative under the BharatGen umbrella is to make it accessible to the entire billion plus population that we have. And if that is the case, uh, this has to be at least a mandate of a small group of people, if not the whole group, who wake up every single day and say, what are we doing to solve for this? Is that how you're looking at it? Or is this, as we keep building the blocks, which itself is so complex, we will keep on figuring out what to do along the way?
No, no, I think it's a lot bigger than that, right? Which is, we do have people that are thinking deeply about this problem at every stage of what we do, right? And again, I go back into the supply chain, starting with the data, right? All the way forward in and downstream into what the consumption of this looks like. The other thing is just partnerships and open conversations we have with researchers in the space that can actually help guide us on this, right? And so there are different dimensions of this, which is what are the ethical uh, what are the ethical practices in the building of AI and in the consumption of AI, and those apply, and how does that apply in terms of how we think about the responsibility work that we're doing as well. The and then it gets, as you double click into that one layer, right? It starts looking like what's the AI that you're doing to build better AI that is more aligned with your objectives, right? Which is, can you have models that are actually evaluating? Can you train a model that is evaluating for fairness? Can you train a model that is evaluating for some categories of bias? right? And so how do you now start to automate, like as you double click in, right? How do you automate the different pieces of how you're generating, how every piece of it, from data to training the model to the subset selection of data that you're going to do to train a model, right? To post training in terms of building in the desirable behaviors, to guardrailing and post LLM procedures to try and do some things, right? And some of it, uh, is even just simpler techniques like fact checking. How accurate is something that's being presented? Can you evaluate the accuracy of what's being presented? Is this LLM hallucinating, right? And I think in India, it's doubly important because I think there'll be so many sensitivities. I was talking to somebody that works in a state government, and they were like, "Look, we'll help you out, but like," and he listed it. He shared a list of like historical figures, and he said, "Look, no matter what, you have to be 100% right and accurate on this group of people, or it's over, right?" And so I think there's a lot of pressure to get some of that right. Um, and I think it's going to be a mix of techniques, people, and groups of people, researchers that have to kind of do this. Uh, yeah, and happy to double click into any of these even more.
No, I think you're double clicking up, and the fact that it's 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 not an afterthought and it's critical and it's being addressed, and I love the fact how you and team are thinking this through. Which I'm going to switch over to the harder part of building AI, right? Now, building this kind of foundational model ecosystem requires immense computational power. You did touch upon this in the beginning when you were talking about the initiative and where you're probably headed. Now, the default assumption for many builders is that you either have to build everything yourself, as in purchase all the GPUs, build that infrastructure layer stack, etc., which is incredibly expensive and time consuming, and can also be cost deterrent as things don't work the way you want it to. Or you go to one of these global hyperscalers. Okay. This creates like a perception that there are only two choices for builders. For a sovereign initiative like BharatGen, what role do ecosystem enablers and partners like sovereign AI native cloud providers, Neysa happens to be one of them, play? How do we and players like us enable an initiative like this? And how does having a third option for the infrastructure layer help you achieve your mission on building this open, accessible platform for India?
Yeah, I love that. And I'll go back to kind of that partnerships model, which is, look, it's hard enough to do what we're doing, without me having to try and get into the hardware layer, right? And then trying to build the level of expertise and specialized knowledge, which takes decades to accumulate. And that's where we rely on partners to be able to provide us that super efficient scaled model of compute that we can use. Now, you rightly pointed out that I think there's two models of, you could go to a hyperscaler, but as a sovereign AI product, I think having a local partner that is doing the engineering locally is super important, right? For us to say, hey, we're actually able to build our models on local infrastructure. The other very interesting part to this is we're really looking for somebody we can partner with closely. And let's just take Neysa as an example. The depth of expertise and dialogue that we can have with an organization like Neysa around you know, minutely optimizing some aspect of network calls such that I can derive a fraction of a percent more efficiency is exactly the kind of conversation that I want to have if I'm going to operate AI at scale, right? And again, these dots all connect back. When I talk about sovereignty, they connect back. When I talk about accessibility and cost, they connect back because I need something that's hyper efficient for the workloads that we're trying to drive. And that's optimized for the kind of things that we're trying to do. And then the other thing is I also need to have this AI inference capability adjacent to where people already live and work. in the digital world or the data center, right? Which is if people are already, data already exists in local Indian data centers. And the last thing we need to do is to ask people to egress those physical data infrastructures to go to new places, right? And so the question I'm always asking is, how do I have my models ingress to where you already live and work as a company, right? In this virtual world, so that we can co-train and optimize our models to run alongside the infrastructure that you already have, right? Because just in terms of regulations and everything else, it's a nightmare to have to kind of move this data around, which is what you'd need to do otherwise.
Oh, it is. And I'm seeing that very, very evident, especially when we are having these conversations with large private entities as well as public enterprises. Super complex, as in, yeah, bringing this environment closer to where the data is definitely the smarter way to look at this approach. So thank you for that insight also, Rishi. I'm going to switch gears a little bit, okay? Before we dive into some of the real world applications, etc., that you folks are building on, this is a short segment. We call it the leader's compass. And these are just going to be quick questions. And the intent is to capture some of your top of mind thoughts. This is the easier section. No tough questions here. Okay.
I'll
Uh,
believe it when I hear the questions, but go ahead, Sujit.
okay. And I picked up some of the cues from our conversation, by the way. Okay. You described yourself as an inherent builder and also an optimist. Okay. Thinking back of as into the early days of your career, when we had the browser world just popping up, the mosaics and the internet explorers of the world era of the web, what would the Rishi of today tell your younger self about the journey ahead with that reference point, as in experiences, how you tinkered with technologies, what it could do, what you thought it could do, and what it ended up doing, how right or wrong you were? Is there anything that you would give yourself as a framework for the future ahead?
That's a great point. I think one thing I would tell myself is that while it'll be possible for you to predict the future, it'll be virtually impossible to time. And so,
True.
at a very early age, to get used to the fact that is timing is something that's difficult to control, and you attribute some of that to just luck. And you learn to make probabilistic bets on what that future looks like, and then be prepared to just be completely wrong on timing of it. And time again, I feel like that's been a lesson. Is it's not hard to tell the future; it's just really hard to time.
Time it. Do you really attempt to time things?
Well, as a product builder and a company builder, that's part of what we do, right? Is you try to be right a lot of times, and timing the investment of when you pull triggers on certain product lines or ideas or even companies is something that's really important and takes a lot of intuition. It's hard to actually teach, what the right time to do something is.
I couldn't agree more. As in, a lot of intuition, gut for me gets built by just having conversations and just constantly keeping yourself abreast with what's happening around you, and then hope that we connect the dots right. But it's a tough one, as in timing it. I completely agree. Thank you for that. But on that note, I'm going to go back to the younger version of Rishi, teenage Rishi. Okay. If the teenage Rishi had access to the kind of generative AI tools we have today, what's the first thing you think you would have tried to build?
Ooh, super interesting. So does that force me back into, like, this would be maybe dating myself, but this would be pre-internet era is is teenage Rishi.
Yeah, you're being fast forwarded into the future. Okay, you've done the time travel. You're here now. You got access to the generative AI tools. How are you going to, as in, what are you
Wow.
going to build first? I asked this question to my 15-year-old. He loves keeping track of all the old automobiles, vehicles, especially cars, okay? Hypercars and the cars that were really built with a lot of intention, okay? He would love to create like an entire catalog of all of those where he could easily almost like create a mind map and figure out which one was the best in doing this How did they solve for that in the engine machinery and so on. So he wants to be able to build that.
Wow. Wow. No, that's amazing. Maybe I'll go back to a couple of like teenage stories here. I remember walking into NIIT at the age of 11 or 12, and they had just recently opened up an outlet in Mumbai, and trying to convince them to enroll me for a class. And they said, look, we really don't teach programming to kids. Like, this is really meant for office people. And so they tried to send me away, and I refused to go away because my dad had told me, you go enroll yourself for this thing if you want it, because I'd been pestering him about this. And so they finally signed me up for like some D-base 4 plus uh, class, which, I proceeded to attend over summer. But the thing that I would do, just knowing what I know now, is to scratch my own itch, is I would create something that would basically allow me to learn whatever I wanted to learn and not be gated by, and by the way, NIT was wonderful at the time, and they didn't know what to do with me, but then they called the manager, then the manager called somebody, and they made some phone calls, and they're like, somebody finally probably said, just take his money and sign him up for something. But but I would use AI to go build something that would unlock learning, and do something really interesting. And if it wasn't for that, then I think I would have to say, you know, as a history buff, I would want to go unlock the Indus Valley script. So if I had the time and the bandwidth as a teenager, that and the AI we have today, that's probably what I would have
Super cool. However, you and your experience with trying to get yourself into an IIT and finally managing to do that probably has got a lot to do with the persistence and grit that's going to come handy for you as you build at BharatGen. But yeah, you could have still solved it as in learning by yourself with AI. So thank you for that. Let's come to this part, Rishi. This has got to do with what would you use as an input, right? As in from all your experience, as in building something like what you're building at BharatGen requires immense long-term vision. What is that one personal input? It could be anything. It could be a book, a philosophy, or maybe a daily habit that helps you maintain the optimism. I know you are an optimist. However, for an initiative like this, it just requires you just require a lot more optimism, considering the barriers, etc., that you have to actually walk through. What is that one single personal input that you look back at or you use consistently?
done. I think there's a certain degree of grounding that I think I got from my grandparents and the Gita that is very practical and applicable in how we lead our lives. And I think one thing to do is just like showing up every day and doing the best that you can do, and investing in sort of the things that you can control, regardless of the output, because you can't control the output. You can't control, what that output will actually look like. But what you can control is showing up excited, eager, and doing the best job that you can do every day. And that's what I sort of tend to focus in on is am I spending time on the right things? Am I spending it in a way that is accretive to, the greater good of wherever I'm living? And am I doing the best job that I can every day? After that, it is whatever it is.
I love that. I love that. I get caught up a lot on what is the end outcome and am I moving in that direction? It does frustrate me a lot, but I will use that one. Let me see if I can train my brain on that one. Let's get to the applications of what you're building at BharatGen, right? And it's about getting a lot of that vision where it has to meet real world applications. A platform like what you are building at BharatGen is only as powerful as the impact on the lives of ordinary citizens, and that's the end goal. You did mention key sectors like agriculture and there's education. There would also be other sectors like healthcare, governance in general, especially for a country of our scale in terms of population and just the complexity of ensuring that everyone gets access to good governance is super critical. Can you paint a picture for us? How will BharatGen tangibly change the way, say, a farmer in a remote village or a student in a vernacular school or a citizen seeking government services interacts with the digital world? As in, I tried as a citizen to go and check if I have access to any public good programs, and I'm telling you, I didn't even know where to start.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. We did this work, by the way, for there's actually a central government department called DARPG, which is the Department of Administrative Reforms and Public Grievances. And you can actually go file a complaint against any sort of government department, and that if you're able to file that that complaint, it actually gets followed up on until like to resolution. Now the tricky part is actually filing that complaint, because in order to file that complaint, you actually have to go through like these complicated drop downs and series of drop downs, and you have to know the name of the department. And maybe you're not getting a gas cylinder, but I don't know what the department is. Like, what's the department of gas cylinders? Like, right? As a citizen, we don't know that stuff. So we actually went and built a prototype for them that allows you to come in and just type your complaint or speak your complaint the way you would think about it, which is, I'm not getting a new gas connection, right? And the system would just ask you, okay, where do you live? And, I live over here. And so who have you applied to? And it would just kind of walk you through like maybe a human would, and say, okay, I get it. You're not getting it. Here's all the information I have with you. I'm going to file a ticket, and we're going to get this looked into, right? And so flipping the model from just like like an opaque government website to an interactive dialogue that speaks human, right, is one of the joys of actually seeing what this new wave of AI is going to. So I think the opportunity, if we look forward, if we do a great job at what we're setting out to do, if you look forward a decade, I think it is completely transformational in terms of citizen access. That ability to simply speak what you want and to go and, like, to your point, what what did you say? What citizen services, or what uh, public
That, as in what, yeah, public good citizen programs do I have access to?
Great, right?
Uh,
And
yeah,
just like that, just being able to ask just that question, and for it to come back to you and say, okay, let me get some more information about you. Like, oh, what's your income, or which city do you live in, or whatever. And for it to come back then with a list of programs. And ideally for you to be able to just say, hey, I want to apply for that one, right? And for it to then sort of, guide you through some of this. And with digital governance, because if it already knows your Aadhaar card or whatever, it should be able to pre-populate that application form and send it off. So I think if you look forward a decade, there's a couple of areas that I think are transformational. I think governance is one of those areas that's super critical to India, which needs to be transformed. And the other one is education. The idea of a personal tutor in every child's pocket, so that any child that is so motivated, because that's key, right? AI is not yet able to motivate people, but for any child that's so motivated, they can just get access to world-class tutoring, so that they can be competitive with the ultimate level playing field. So they could be competitive with anyone that's sitting in New Delhi or Bangalore in terms of access to tutoring and education for what they're looking to do.
that was super cool. As in, on that motivation part, I think Indians generally are very motivated individuals who want to keep on improving their lives every single day. Maybe a little selfish, but I think we still have that intrinsic motivation. One of the reasons why I see Indians, when you take them out of India and put them in other areas or regions where there is a lot more economic opportunity, we do phenomenally well. So that comes from that intrinsic motivation. If we have tools like this, I'm sure it'll do better. I was actually visualizing this while you were speaking, Rishi. As in, can AI become like this universal interface for any citizen in the country and can solve it? Could be to file a grievance or probably ask, do I have access to a crop subsidy if I'm a farmer? Or as a student saying, I want to learn this because I'm going to prepare for this exam. How can I prep? Can it become that layer 10 years down the line?
That would be amazing, right? And the specifics, I think the jury's out on the specifics, right? There's arguments about, agentic approaches, How much of this will be done on the client? How much of this will be done on the server? What are the interfaces that will need to be exposed? Let's gloss over the details for for a minute here. But I think there's definitely a few solution candidates in the pool, but I think that the idea where an agent or multiple agents can be your interface to the things that you're looking for is so much more intuitive, right? Even the idea of the a web, that if you reimagine what a web application or an app on your phone looks like in an AI first world, I think it looks very different because then you don't have static layouts of content anymore, right? And Sujit, when he goes to his bank, has maybe a different set of things that Sujit wants to do. And the app is reorienting and recreating itself dynamically to give you access to what you're doing, right? Uh, and maybe it's giving you different modalities rather than sort of like today's world of like hierarchical layouts and navigation, right? I think it's going to look, I think a decade out, everything that we do it looks a lot different. Now, I did make the big sin of predicting the future, right? I should not, right? It's one thing to predict it. It's another one of actually trying to time.
I agree. I agree. But you know what? If you don't dream it, you'll not make it happen. So it's good to keep on dreaming. I love that. I'm also fascinated by another aspect, right? And I was going back to the data supply chain part that you touched upon earlier, Rishi. In this era where it's going to be super critical as we keep on digitizing content, right? And in the case of what you folks are trying to drive, you're trying to digitize as much content as possible, multilingual, cultural, etc. How are you thinking of creating a powerful economic and practical incentive for India's diverse language sources to thrive in this AI era? As in, is that something that comes to mind? Because that's going to be an important real world problem to solve so that this continues to keep thriving rather than it becoming like a one-time exercise, which obviously we know is not going to be how AI can continue to keep on unlocking value for citizens in a sovereign nation like India.
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean that's such a great point. I think a lot of tech players will basically focus on telling you, look, I just need enough to get going in terms of consumption, and then the consumption drives the data cycle, and it's a virtuous cycle in terms of being able to adapt and improve with the data that you have. And then you're maybe able to bring more languages into the fray. But I do ask that question around how do you have equitable distribution of value back to creators? And by creators, I mean both the formal creators, when you think about people who are authors, but also the
Mhm.
informal creators, and people who are creating dialogue, who are uploading reels, right? What does it look like when that data is then used for LLMs and training? And how do you create more equitable distribution of value so that more people can participate in the creator side of the economy? So
Super critical.
yeah, and I think there's some companies that are working on this, but I think we need innovation. Just we need a lot of innovation in that sector too.
Mhm. So builders who is listening in, you know another area that we need to solve for as we keep moving forward. Okay, let's this is almost like elephant in the room question. Okay, looking forward, and I think this big narrative that keeps floating around multiple times, right? As India missed the foundational large language model bus. Okay. Now, as a builder, you are inherently optimistic. How do you respond to a question like that? Is it like just this two-way race between US, China, or I think fundamentally with initiatives like BharatGen, India is probably building a completely new way of how we are going to participate in the race.
Yeah, this thing does keep coming up, and what's amusing for me is that when we started this work off, uh, I'm busy trying to hire some people. We had a very, very small core team. We're still getting our office set up. And then Sam Altman visits New Delhi and he gets on stage and he's like, yeah, that's a terrible idea for India to be building its own AI. And it's all over the media. And
Yeah.
then another very prominent sort of, luminary from India's IT world gets on stage and he's like, Yeah, I think we should focus on application. And so I get these phone calls from people who are like, "Hey, Rishi, these guys think that what you're doing is a dumb idea." So it's like, okay, so it really starts with that sort of, oh, it's too late, it can't be done, we can't do it. And I think that's fundamentally part of the challenge is we have to flip this and say, no, if somebody else is doing it, we can surely do it. We can do a better job of it, and we can stay competitive. I think that's just an India thing that we need to flip. The other thing that maybe I'll just call out is this technology is going to be rapidly distributed and become ubiquitous, right? And so what is in the hands, and you know this, like you've been doing this for a while, but technology inherently depreciates, right? And becomes
So,
becomes more accessible, right? So what is today's rarefied commodity becomes more and more, and it happens at a very rapid pace too. So I don't feel like this is going to be one of those things where there's going to be only a couple of countries in the world that are going to do this. I actually think that, BharatGen and India is going to play a role in actually democratizing access to this. And I think many other countries, like, as a number four economy, we might play a leading role in the democratization of this tech. But I think many other countries are going to want to have similar access to their own sovereign AI products and going to want to do this type of build. So we're not unique in that respect.
I'm on the same boat, frankly, Rishi. As in, I genuinely feel with all that we have started off with, both public initiatives and private initiatives, and I think the public-private model, more democratic, not kind of concentrated with a few private players, federated approach to solving what we need to solve as a nation can actually become like a framework that even a lot of the other nations, especially in the global south, who probably have very similar constraints, like India, would actually be more than happy to kind of use as a playbook as they solve their sovereign AI requirements. I genuinely believe that.
Yeah, that'll be amazing for us to see. And I think that's part of, some of the hard challenges in AI that we'll need to solve, I think will be applicable for others too. And some of these are going to be like the challenge of low resource languages and how do you build AI
True.
on top of those. Now we'll be at BharatGen, we'll be publishing many of the approaches that we use. So we've already published a lot on archive. We publish with
Awesome.
partners. And so again, like I said, democratize access. Let's make more builders.
Cool. Rishi, to close, okay, here's a question, and this is Rishi, the product leader, right? And this is generally a question as in for thousands of builders, founders, product leaders who will end up listening to this episode. You've navigated the 0 to 1 journey on billion-dollar commercial products, and now you're tackling a foundational 0 to 1 challenge for an entire nation, right? As in you're part of that initiative. What is that one piece of non-obvious advice you would give to someone in tech today where I think every day we wake up and it seems like we just missed something, okay? Who's looking to build an ambitious and impactful career, okay? This is more for the younger builders, perhaps by redefining what success means to them. I love the the philosophy from Greta that you picked up from your grandparents. That's a great way to look at it. But is there any other non-obvious advice that you would actually give to the younger folks today?
That's a tough one. I wouldn't claim to have non-ob non-obvious ones, but what I will say is especially for builders in India, um, you know, learn to learn to embrace other risk takers, people who are willing to go out there and like be willing to go out there and fail and be willing to embrace failure and be willing to, willing to embrace and support other people who are risk takers and builders out in the community. I think you know, what we need to do here, especially for the younger crowd, is to build that group of people who want to build in India, who are willing to embrace risk, and then create the support structure for people who can go out and do this type of work out there. So not not so much a non-obvious one, but I think it's one to truly embrace is, to embrace that, to embrace the creator mindset, to embrace the risk-taking mindset, and to to embrace that not just as an individual but as a community as well, so that we can support each other.
And I love that, Rishi. Rishi, thank you for this masterclass of an episode. I just had a ball of a time having this conversation and into your perspectives, experience as a builder of products, so both complex at billion-dollar value scale, which is revenue driven or profit driven, as well as building something that's going to solve challenges or adoption of challenges for technologies like AI at a nation level with what you're doing at BharatGen. What I truly believe that you and team are actually proving that the most powerful AI won't just be the one that is the most intelligent, but probably the one that is the most inclusive. And it's been an absolute privilege to get access to some of those thoughts and your experience while building this. All the best to you and team, Rishi. It's been absolutely fabulous having this conversation.
Thank you so much, Sujit. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Likewise. To learn more about the groundbreaking work being done at BharatGen, do visit bharatgen.com. And to discover the AI native cloud platform that helps innovators like Rishi and team build for scale, check out Neysa.ai. Don't forget to subscribe to AI's Happy Hour for more conversations like this with people architecting our AI future. Until next time.